Boardroom Bound, episode 108, Top Tips on Successful Personal Branding with Alyssa Gelbard.
The foundation of how we work with both people and now companies as well is taking the principles of marketing and branding and bringing it to people. So thinking about what are you trying to, from an individual executive perspective, what are you trying to do?
Hello and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's episode, we're speaking with Alyssa Gelbard, and she is a personal branding and marketing guru. She is someone who helps individuals and organizations to figure out all aspects of personal branding to drive visibility. So an easy way to think about this, LinkedIn, very powerful tool that we all need and have to, I don't know if I want to say perfect, but really get right for our boardroom stuff. She helps optimize for virtual presence, strengthening LinkedIn profiles, and help people figure out how to market themselves for a board seat. There are so many tips that we're all going to pick up from today's episode. Let's jump into the show. Today's episode is sponsored by Patina Solutions. Patina has asked me to host a webinar on February 9th. This event will be invaluable for most everyone in my audience since it's all about how to secure your first board seat. I'm guessing you're listening to this podcast because you want to join a board, but perhaps you're stymied by the process. If that's you, then join me as I host a webinar on February 9th. Participants will take away tools and gain expertise to help secure their first public or private company board seat. You can find more details in today's show notes or learn more at bit.ly/boardseat. That's bit.ly/boardseat. And now let's jump into today's episode. Alyssa Gelbard, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Thank you, Alexander. Excited to be here.
Well, I'm excited about this because I talk with our students in career services all the time about social media, and I try to explain to them that the one I prefer is LinkedIn. They don't think that's social media. And I'm explaining, well, in the business world, it really is, and I think it's a lot of fun. I realize I'm in the minority here, and I look at your background experience, and clearly personal branding marketing covers lots of stuff. But when I think about the boardroom space, LinkedIn is so critical, and I know all of our listeners can probably all do it better, no matter how much time, like me, you probably spend on thinking about it. So I'm excited to have you on the show today. But before we get into some of that actionable advice and tips and your war stories, let's just do a little bit on your background so people can understand how it goes. And, when you look at your LinkedIn profile, it's pretty cool. The first thing you see is sort of all the hockey league stuff that started, right?
Yeah, it's there for a reason, actually, which I'm happy to explain. But I'll give you the quick and dirty. So my background is strategic marketing and branding. And yes, early in my career, I was in sports marketing. And never actually intended to have my own business. It was never on my radar screen. I was always focused on branding and building brands. And it was for companies, and products and services. It was never about the people. And what happened was through time, as people would come to me for advice. I've also always been a connector and would advise business people in business development who are hiring. And what I didn't realize was I was sowing the seeds for the business. Mm. And at one point, people started, outside of my organizations. And then when it became people I didn't know, I said, let me just hang up a shingle and just see what happens, just because it was fun to me. And it immediately became senior executives saying, how can I tell my story to get to my next step in my career, whether it was their next C-suite role or if they were looking to land a board seat or get their next board seat. And, it's at the time I was still working full time, had people working, I had a team and, because it was never an intention. And all of a sudden I said, wait a second, I think I've got something good here. This business is growing. So I gave it some strategic focus and I said, yeah, this is what I want to do. And the foundation of how we work with both people and now companies as well is taking the principles of marketing and branding and bringing it to people. So thinking about what are you trying to, from an individual executive perspective, what are you trying to do what's the, and then developing the messaging around that so you can get there, and not just thinking about it in one channel, but thinking about it across all the different ways that people encounter you. And especially when you are, looking for the, bringing it to the boardroom, when you're thinking about that, how you market and brand yourself as a director is not the same as when, there's some overlap, but it's not the same when you're looking for your next, senior leadership role.
Right.
It's, so there's some nuance there. And the same thing, through companies, we help companies make better brand impressions through their people. So focusing on the people part of things. So that's, it's not exactly a straight route, but that's how I got here, and have been advising executives and companies and boards for about, I think now about 7 years, something like that.
Well, this is relevant to every single listener on this podcast, because everyone needs to do more, better, different, however you want to think about where you are in your journey. So this is wonderful for us to dig into today. But before we start talking about things like marking yourself for a board seat or strengthening your LinkedIn profile, let's first talk about resume versus LinkedIn. And there's a push-pull strategy, some people would say, is you can send out your resume at the appropriate time to people, but hopefully while you're asleep, if you've built the right LinkedIn profile, maybe you're drawing people to you. And I realize it's more complicated than that, but I know you have probably a very different philosophy than most on which is most important. So when people say, I'm going to get on this board journey, people think I got to build my bio, I got to build my resume, I got to do my LinkedIn, all this other stuff. And you have a philosophy of where you think you should start on that. I'd love if you'd share that with us.
Yeah, I absolutely do. And I do think it's a little different than most, because I believe LinkedIn first, resume, board bio second. And that's a different thought than an approach that I had, a handful of years ago. But because of the growth and importance of LinkedIn in our everyday professional lives, it can't be an afterthought, because it's on 24/7. People can find you, like you said, in your sleep. And whether those people who are looking for you are from a board search firm, whether they are contacts, whether they're someone, on, a nominating committee, it could be a wide variety of people. But point being that you really want to be focusing on it before your resume, because that is something that you can send out afterwards. I'm not a big fan of just a cold email with a resume before a conversation. Now, there are instances where where that's fine, but generally speaking, when you're networking, that's not the big get. I don't think that's as good of a way to start networking conversation as at least LinkedIn to have, so there's some basis of information there. Because even if we have a call set up that's based on an email, that person is on the other side is going to be looking at your profile before the conversation. You don't want to have to start saying, oh gosh, it's missing some critical information about my board experience or my board education, or nonprofit boards that I'm involved in. You don't want to think about that after a conversation. You want that to be up and ready beforehand. So now that doesn't, and I think there's also different stages, and we can get into a little bit of how you update your profile. But at least, because understanding your value proposition is really important, and maybe for first-time directors, they need to, really talk to a number of people so they can hone that. But at least having it updated to a certain point is critical before you then start working on the resume and bio and sending those out after a conversation.
Well, Alyssa, let's take a very high level, maybe 30,000 foot view of LinkedIn, maybe where it used to be versus it is now, right? If you go back 10 years or so ago, some people thought about it was just an online representation of your resume. And it was probably written in third person. It was impersonal. And I feel like it is very different now. And I'm actually a big fan of first person in there, because it's a human element that comes across. There's your photo there. You want people to see what you look and feel like, and would you be a cultural fit with the organization? But what is your impression? What do you recommend? I don't think it's just a resume. How do you think about it?
So I agree that it's certainly evolved. I mean, I've been on LinkedIn since 2006, and I've really seen it change. And I think for a long time, people thought about it just as, oh, well, you need to be on there and make sure you're optimized if you're looking for a job. Mm-hmm. And that was it. And it's really, that's really changed over time. And, first person, third person, that kind of depends on your personal style and preference. I, too, am a big fan of first person because it gives it personality and dimension. But I understand for people that that may be hard. You can still have a really great profile that's in that third person. I actually don't think it should be in third person. I think it should be in that objective voice, sort of that resume speak, because if it's written like a bio, it sounds like someone else is talking about you, but it's your profile. So it shouldn't sound like someone else is writing about you, because you're the only one who should be writing about yourself on your profile.
Well, what are the stages that someone should go through to overhaul their LinkedIn? Because for most of our listeners, it's going to be written from the executive perspective, right? Which is very much,
right.
I have led these teams, we have achieved this, which makes sense. If that's the jobs you've gone for, you've grown and developed in organizations. But now if you are beginning to change that for the board stuff, it's quite a different story you're telling.
Correct. And what's interesting, one of the things I think is of the beauty of LinkedIn is that you can show multiple dimensions, where if you have a board resume, that resume is different from your regular operational executive resume. On LinkedIn, you can share multiple things. And the key for people to think about is, what's the primary message and what's the secondary message? So if you are leading a company and you want to be a director, but your first impression that you need to make is still that you are, have whatever leadership role is. That's important to think about in terms of how that impacts what you say in your headline, how you write your summary, and even how you position things in your experience. If you have some concurrent, your day job, if you will, and current boards that you serve on. But that message, that hierarchy is important to know which you say first versus, do you want the board message to be first? How prominent should it be? So I think that's key to think about first. And then really some of those key sections that make those critical first impressions, because you can't take those first impressions back. And I think it's even, it's even before we talk about some of the important sections to update, I think, it's worth it to take a step back to talk about a few other things, why this is important, not just because someone may be looking at you, or for an introduction, but, those first impressions are so important. So it's for the search. If someone's making an introduction, when I think about when I introduce two people by email, I always send a link. I embed the link of their name as their LinkedIn profile. By optimizing what you're saying, it enhances your credibility, especially as a potential director. It also increases your visibility, not just when people are searching for you, but as you are connecting with people in your target audiences, and when you, perhaps if you get into content engagement, that's a whole other topic, but it helps when you're, as you're looking to build your network and continue to network. Especially, in the board space, if perhaps your network is in one narrow area and you do understand the critical importance to networking as you're looking for a board seat. And it also, like I mentioned before, I think it enables that better connection. And that's before conversations, meetings, networking conversations, and also ultimately when you get to the interview stage, during the board process, what you're saying in your profile is really, really important. And an optimal profile, generally speaking, needs to reflect your board value, and that's something that is critical to think about, as you go through this process. What are you bringing to the table as a director? Too many people say, well, I just want to be, I want to be a director. Well, why? You have to be able to articulate that, as well as what you actually bring. What experiences and expertise are you bringing? And then that should be, you want to be communicating that, as well as any current and past board roles. That's something I think people forget all the time. Oh yeah, that was, an advisory board I served on, I don't know, it was for a year, like 5 or 6 years ago. But that's board experience, nonprofit experience, committee work. Those are all things to show, as well as, and people say, okay, but I don't have very much, either I don't have any previous board experience or I have very little. And so then what you can do is emphasize your board relevant experience. And I think that's critical for executives to really focus on that, what is board relevant? So that can be so many different kinds of things. M&A, succession planning, obviously strategic involvement, risk management, transformation, global product launches, things like that, of course, committees and task forces, helping with strategic priorities, how you build consensus in certain situations. Those are just some ideas, but you want to be able to communicate that information, and whether that's in your summary or succinctly in your experience section. But it's really, really important to do that. And not to have it be so cut and dry. To your point about first person, even if you're not writing in first person, is it, incredibly boring where someone kind of reads or written, where it's lengthy, where someone's just going to kind of, a lot of times people will cut and paste things from the resume,
right,
or a bio, and then it becomes, there's no breaks, and people, will get turned off. So, they may not read if it's not easy to read and not sort of friendly, if you will.
So I think that as a high-level summary makes so much sense. And I'm sure many of my audience started going, okay, all right, I know I need to go make some changes. How should I do that? For example, clearly they're going to start with the headline, right? Because that's what jumps out and what stands out. And I imagine the discussion going through the minds of my listeners right now is like, how clear should I be about this? I mean, should I change the opening to say something like seeking corporate board position? And in whatever break you make to make your next section of whatever words you want in there, like sitting CEO or something. How do you feel about that sort of phraseology where you're really being clear with whoever's seeing your profile that that's what you want to do?
So I'm not a fan because I feel like your headline should define who you are and the expertise and value that you bring, and not that you're seeking something. I feel the same way for job seekers as well. It's who are you? What are you bringing to the table? Because no one, when you think about searches, when you get down to some of the nitty gritty, when someone's searching, they're not using the word seeking. Mm-hmm. No one's looking. Someone who's in board search is not going to put in the word seeking. You know what I mean? So it's, what are you bringing to the table? So that's where I think with the headline, you can write it in. And again, one of the nice things about LinkedIn is there's a lot of flexibility in how you can say things. So you can write it as a phrase. You can write things separated by slashes or pipes, the vertical lines, or dashes, commas to separate thoughts, because you can be several different things. So think about what are some of those areas of unique value that you bring. Is it deep industry expertise? Is it something very specific that is incredibly, let's say it's M&A as an example. Is that your thing? Is it is it the global part of your experience? What are the things that is going to make you attractive as a board candidate, as well as and make sure though that you don't have, especially if you are still focusing on your day job, if you will, that it doesn't sound all board related, that there is a mix. So I'm not a big fan of the seeking. I also think when you talk about that initial first impression and what section should you focus on, your headshot is critical. Right. I mean, absolutely critical. There are too many people who have shots that are either, doesn't look like them anymore. And, and in any sense of the word, whether that's color of their hair, length of their hair, glasses, not glasses, that's one piece that's very, very important. But also, is it recognizable? Do you look like that? So if someone, right now sees you, let's say on video call, but, or knows you from in person, does it even look like you? And also, are you making the impression as a director? Is it a very casual image? I'll tell you a story. One of my favorite stories. So this goes back to a couple of years now. I had a client who was a CEO of a global company and also is a very experienced board director. We were updating, all of his materials and helping him market himself to really kind of up-level the types of boards he was serving on. And his headshot he was in fashion, in the fashion industry, and an impeccably dressed gentleman. And his headshot was so casual. He was wearing a gray fleece. He was standing on a rock. It must have been taken when he was on vacation. He was also about 50 pounds heavier. It looked nothing like him. And he was in my office. I made him actually stand up. I took a picture with my phone and sent it to him, made him upload it on the spot, and then hooked him up with a photographer, and he has a lovely headshot. But he said, I didn't think about it. When I created my profile, it was blah, 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 blah. And I said, that doesn't speak director. It also doesn't speak to your industry. That was a second, that was a whole another piece of, issue that we had to deal with. But it was more, that's not, you're an experienced leader, and that headshot did not communicate that. And LinkedIn has all kinds of statistics, and I'm happy to share those with you about just even the numbers of why you need to have a headshot, and how many more views you will have, and the likelihood of people connecting with you. But I am hoping that everybody listening at least has a headshot at this point.
I think the simple analogy I tend to use, it's like a dating website. If you were on there, you wouldn't click on someone who didn't have a photo. And if you actually met the person, they better look like that photo too.
100%. And the same thing with real estate. If you're looking for a house or an apartment, and there's no image, it's and they're not looking to see what you're wearing or how attractive you are. They just want to know that there's a person there. And also the person that's representing kind of what they're interested in.
And to your point, you can get a better one right away until you get the best one later, right? So make an incremental improvement immediately if you don't have that already. And, as long as we're talking about images, I think this is glossed over by some people. When you start your LinkedIn profile, if you don't pay attention to it, you have this generic blue background behind you. Mm-hmm. But I see that as real estate. I share this with my students all the time. You want to reinforce the message that you want to get across with that. It's subtle, but it's a powerful thing. How do you think about that? What do you advise?
I agree with you. It's definitely a missed opportunity. And even if you just put a solid color there, you're already taking a step to differentiate. I think what you have to be careful with that banner image is that you don't make it too personal. I am still one of those old school LinkedIn believers that LinkedIn is a professional, a professional place, not a personal. And yes, there's some blending, and you want to make it personal, but it is not Instagram. It is not Facebook. So if you like birds, it should not, your banner, image should not be birds unless you have, some type of experience in that industry, or perhaps you serve on the board of some, nonprofit. Exactly. But you have to be careful there. But absolutely agree with you that it's a great place to stand out, and so many people don't. At least they updated it from the constellation look to the little more, but still, definitely a great opportunity.
And for me, it was so simple. I'm always playing around with what would be a better representation of the boardroom. And I always have something in there where I'm playing with, like, this is just what I want people to be thinking as they're looking at my profile. And I look at it sort of like the top of the resume. You have enough when someone glances at it, like, okay, I'd like to go down and read a little bit more. And the next section, which is so critical, is clearly the summary. And you see different philosophies. Some people have nothing there, and I feel like, well, you're missing a chance to tell your story. But you'll see a range between something really short to a good story. And I think your profile is an example of someone you've clearly spent a lot of time thinking about how to use that summary space to get across what you want to do. How do you advise people to use this most appropriately?
So, a whole bunch of things to unpack here. So first, you have 2,600 characters in that section, which is a lot. I do not think you need to take up that entire section. Very much to your point, you want people to scroll and continue reading. If you have a summary that is so dense, they may not make it to the experience section, volunteer, and you want them to see those areas because maybe that's an area of commonality, or maybe there's something in that section that's really important, because you don't want to restate everything that you have in the rest of your profile in the top. Now there's certain things that you can repeat, but you don't want to restate everything. I am a very big fan of making sure the first 3 lines have the biggest impact. Because, as you mentioned, when someone lands on your profile, you see that top part. They see the first few lines, and then it says, the little, the language about see more. What if you start with? A lot of people start with how they started their career. That may have zero relevance to what they're doing today or why I want to connect with you. So have the biggest pack the biggest punch in the beginning, and then you can go into other things. And I think it's real. Again, this is where that hierarchy of information comes. Where does the board, your board experience or board relevant experience go? It might be first, it might be second, but it shouldn't be buried, which is what too many people do and say, as an afterthought at the end. As well, your areas of expertise can be listed there in sentence form, in bullet form. If you have, all things that make you, I think the things that really make you unique and stand out can go in there that are relevant. Again, you want to take a step back and think about relevancy. Who am I trying to reach? Who do I want to engage with? Who do I want to see who I am? And I want to make sure that message, the language that I'm using, the information that I'm including is relevant to them. Because if I'm talking about something else and it doesn't have relevancy to the people I'm trying to connect with, then they may not scroll further down. They may not be interested. They may have gotten to me, but they may not stay with me, if you will. I also think that you want to think in terms of readability in that section. So very often you have paragraphs that are too long. And it's about scrolling. So many people look on their phones that if you have a long, dense paragraph, people may miss something really critical in there that you want them to know about you. For example, I always keep a couple of paragraphs too long because I often, when I'm speaking about LinkedIn, I use my profile as sort of the example, and I like to have a few examples of what not to do. But you do want to think about length of sentence. You can have the nice thing about LinkedIn is you can have a one-line paragraph, totally fine. You can mix up bullets and paragraphs. You can write it, to your point, you could write it in first person. For those who are not sure if they want to do it and they really want to get their summary down first, write it in that more objective voice so you know what you want to communicate, and then start, working on making it into first person. But I also, one big piece of advice is don't do it live on the site. Do it either in a Word document or in an email draft, but don't be updating everything in real time on the site, because if you make a mistake or delete something that you didn't mean to, it's a recipe for disaster. So, start with it offline and then bring it online. And if you are converting it to first person, save it save it so you know what you've written in the past in case you want to go back to it.
And to that point, I would love your thoughts on this. To me, one of the downsides of LinkedIn summary is I should have a lot more formatting options. I should be able to use things like bolds, and I just don't understand why it's not there. Maybe someday it will be, but it's very limited in what you can do to stand out. So some things that I've seen, and people have, say, use all caps and sort of almost have a section heading or a leading into a space, who I am, what I do, where you've seen me, that sort of stuff. You don't have that on yours, and I wonder what you advise to people.
I think I think that's definitely personal preference. How do you like to communicate? What is your communication style? Definitely some people need to be pushed a little bit more. But I too really wish that you could have formatting options. I really don't know why they have not made that available. You can, a lot of people will use, and I think you do as well, emojis or icons. I'll tell you why I don't use those, because I tend to like to geek out a little bit and do a lot of research on from the engineering perspective and what drives visibility. And the jury's out about if those things have any impact on how your profile displays. LinkedIn doesn't make a statement either way, but my feeling is until I know definitively, I don't want to do anything on my profile that perhaps could hinder it. I've asked, and I've heard both sides of it, where experts that I know will say, "Oh yeah, it's totally fine," and others say, "Well, I'm not sure. I'm not doing it yet." But in terms of outlining, what you do and how you do it and things like that, that's again, I think that's personal style. But it's also, will that work? Does that work with how you're trying to communicate based on where you are in your director journey? If you're starting for the first time, if you're 100% or, have a large percentage of your focus on board-related work or work within, working with directors and working with boards in general. So I think it depends on what you do in terms of how you kind of can communicate it. For you, I think it's a lot more. I don't want to say it's cut and dry, but it's almost like it's kind of cut and dry. I think if you had a completely different kind of career and you were doing what you're doing, I think it would be a little harder to communicate. So it might, or harder to fit within headings.
Makes sense.
So,
and Alyssa, I'm amazed. We could probably spend hours going through this in all great detail, which is fantastic. But I want to make sure we get a little bit of time to talk about the experience section, because that is so critical.
Yeah.
One example is like how much to put underneath and sort of the format behind it. And obviously it's very different if you're writing for executive versus board. What do you recommend to people?
Well, exactly. It really is different whether you're writing for executive boards. And you do not, one thing I would say is you want to have enough information, but not too much, because again, remember, people are reading this online. So really think about what you're saying, what you want to say, and then making sure you're saying it in the most concise way possible. And again, it's not your CV, so you don't have to list everything that you've ever done. I absolutely think you should go beyond your title and date, because that doesn't really provide information. That gives you some information, but not enough. What did you do in those roles? And use that board lens. What is board relevant? So if you're talking about, your current role, your previous, most previous role, what in those roles are board relevant, and make sure you include that. And depending on where you are in your career, you may need to include other information as well, as you are staying relevant in your executive role. But you don't need to provide detail going, back far. But what I would say is, one of the questions I get all the time is, how far back do I go? Do I need to include everything? Mm-hmm. Well, it depends on what where your focus is moving forward. So, perfect example, you mentioned, as we started our conversation about my experience in the hockey world. So my first job when I was interning, when I was getting my MBA, I interned at the American Hockey League, and then worked there as a freelancer as I was finishing up my second year. Now, I never had that on my profile. I didn't need to. Why would I? That was so long ago. However, when I was asked to be on the advisory board of a graduate sports management program, and, all of a sudden I said, that's relevant, because there are some people who have ties to the American Hockey League, and it increased my credibility. Even though it was experienced a long time ago, it showed, that I had actually, in addition to working at the NHL, but it showed multiple organizations within an industry, and that industry was important for this program. So for the advisory board, I added it. So, it's taking a look and saying it depends. How far back you go, does it matter? But also thinking about the types of boards that you want to serve on. And if you have relevancy from way back when, there are people that you can connect with. When we talk about networking, is such a critical part of your board journey, and really something that I think I really, that people still, I think, underestimate the importance of it. If I am looking, let's say, for an example, I want to get involved. I'd like to serve on the board of an entertainment or sports or something like that. That's where I'd like to. That's one of my target types of companies. Well, then I should be reconnecting with, or looking to reconnect and doing my homework to see who do I know from earlier career that are relevant in that industry. Just as an example. So how far back you go depends. What kind of detail you include depends. But what I wouldn't do is focus on detail that's only from an operational perspective. You really want to think about the board relevancy if you're marketing yourself that way. And again, if you're doing the dual thing, which so many people are, you still can do both. But you don't want a laundry list of 10 things under each role. It's to invite conversation and create interest.
Well, Alyssa, as always happens on the show, the time flies, and I feel like there's so much more I wanted to cover today, but I want to make sure I leave a couple minutes for you at the end. I'm sure there's many things you wanted to get through we didn't get to today. What's the most important we didn't talk about so far with LinkedIn that you wish all our audience knew?
That's a very good question. I think, one thing that we mentioned, the resume and LinkedIn, information there needs to match. You can't say that you have titles and dates in one place that are different from your resume. I think there needs to be alignment there. But I think that's one key thing, and that it should be your profile is an evolving thing, that it evolves as you evolve professionally, but it feels very overwhelming to update a profile, and do it in pieces and get it to a place where it's better than it is now, and then go back and give some focused attention on each section, including, by the way, one section we didn't mention, which is the skills section. It's still very important, and make sure your skills aren't just related to your operational experience, that there's a lot of board relevant skills there that if you have them, and of course you never want to include something that you don't have, make sure you include that. In your volunteer section, if you've served on nonprofit boards, if you've chaired committees or participated in committees, include those kinds of things. Professional memberships, make sure you include those. You can include that under organizations. List those. Board education, that's another thing. Make sure if you've gone through certification, if you have certifications or have taken courses relating to governance and other things, include those on your profile. You want to build out how all of anything, experience, education, training, skills that you have that are relevant to building yourself as a better board candidate. So look at every section and make sure you can optimize each one and take that step back and say, do I include everything in this section that's board relevant? And if you don't, go through section by section and update them.
Well, Alyssa, we have covered so much ground today, and the best part is everyone can start doing simple things. Some are harder than others and will take a little more time, but some are really simple, like a better photo would be a good place to start. We can all sit back and think about this. We were delighted to have you on this show today. Thank you for sharing your insights and helping all of us to be boardroom bound.
It was a pleasure. Thank you. And I hope I didn't stress too many people out who are running out to go up.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Alyssa Gelbard. She gave so many actionable advice steps that all of us can implement, and we can do something so simply today, and other things are big picture but really worth doing. I know I'm going to make some of those changes myself. Be sure to head over to podcast.gordon.edu where you will get links to all of today's resources. And please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you'll miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.